And biomass and water, be able to describe the various forms of biomass and also explain how energy is harnessed from water. Energy comes from the sun. So the sun is the ultimate source of available types of energy. Study the diagram and we'll do each individual part separately. All right, essentially biomass is energy from the sun. All fossil fuels and most renewable energy sources, ultimately they come from the sun. So biomass energy resources encompass a large class of fuel types that include wood and charcoal and animal products and manure, plant remains, and also, municipalities' solid waste, as well as like liquid fuels and ethanol and biodiesel. So there's many forms of biomass used directly as fuel. And one biomass can also be processed and refined into liquid fuels like ethanol and biodiesel, and all of this stuff is collectively known as a biofuel. These fuels are used in more limited quantities just due to the technological demands associated with their use. For example, it is easier to burn a log in the fireplace than it is to develop the technology to produce a compound like ethanol. And like fossil fuels, biomass contains a great deal of carbon, and burning it releases that carbon into the atmosphere. Given the fact that both fossil fuels and biomass raise atmospheric carbon concentration, it is really better for the environment to replace fossil fuels with biomass. I mean, is it? I guess that answer to that question would depend on how the material is harvested and it's processed and how the land is really treated during this harvesting. It probably would also depend on how long the carbon would need to be stored. All right, so the carbon that's found in plants growing today was in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide until recently, when it was incorporated into the bodies of the plants through a process known as photosynthesis. So, depending on the type of plant that it comes from, the carbon in biomass fuels may have been captured through photosynthesis as recently as a few months ago, as in the case of like a corn plant, or perhaps up to several hundreds of years in the case of wood from like a very, very large tree. We call the carbon in biomass modern carbon, and in contrast to the carbon in fossil fuels, which we call fossil carbon. Bet you didn't see that coming. And an activity that does not change atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations is referred to as what we call carbon neutral. Whether you're using biomass is truly carbon neutral or not, however, is an important thing to think about here. It's currently being discussed by scientists and some policymakers because sometimes the use of modern carbon ends up releasing CO2 into the atmosphere that would otherwise have remained in the soil or fossil fuels. All right, so throughout the world, 2 billion to 3 billion people rely on wood for heating and cooking. In the United States, approximately 3 million homes use wood as their primary heating fuel, and more than 20 million homes use wood for energy, at least at some point in time. But in addition, the pulp and the paper industries, power plants, and other industries that use wood waste and byproducts for energy are also contributing to that. So, in theory, cutting trees for fuel is sustainable if the forest keeps on growing as we use up the forest. Unfortunately, many forests, like those in our Haiti example that we've seen before, are cut so intensively that they allow for little chance of regrowth. So, removing timber that is replaced by growth is what we call the net removal of forest. Many people in the developing world, they use wood to make charcoal, which is a superior fuel for many reasons. Charcoal is lighter than wood and it contains approximately twice as much energy per unit of weight or of mass. So a charcoal fire produces much less smoke than a wood fire does. And it doesn't need to be tended to constantly as like a wood fire. So, although it is more expensive than wood, charcoal is a fuel of choice for urban areas in the developing world and for families who can afford it. Harvesters who clear an area of land to make charcoal for charcoal production often leave it almost completely devoid of trees, and they clear cut it. In regions where wood is scarce, like parts of Africa and India, people often use dried animal manure as fuel for indoor heating and cooking. And burning this manure can be beneficial because it removes harmful microorganisms from like the surrounding areas, which basically reduces the chance of disease and disease transmission. But burning manure also releases particulate matters and other type of pollutants into the air that cause a variety of problems like respiratory illnesses and emphysema and cancer. So the problem is exacerbated when the manure is burned indoors in like poorly ventilated homes. So a common situation, which is too many developing countries' dwellings. The World Health Organization, the WHO, which we've talked about, estimates that the indoor air pollution is responsible for nearly 2 million deaths annually. So we're going to cover some indoor air pollutions and the effects on human health. Whether indoors or outdoors, burning biomass fuel basically produces a variety of air pollutants, and that includes particulate matter, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, which are also another component of air pollution. The liquid biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel, can be used as substitutes for gasoline and diesel, respectively. Ethanol is an alcohol that is made by converting starches and sugars from plant materials into alcohol and carbon dioxide. More than 90% of the ethanol produced in the United States comes from corn and corn byproducts. Although ethanol can be used to produce sugarcane, wood chips, produced from sugarcane and wood chips, crop waste, and even switchgrass. Biodiesel is a diesel substitute which is produced by extracting and chemically altering oil from plants. It is a substitute for regular petroleum diesel. It is usually produced by extracting oil from algae and plants like soybeans and palm trees. And in the U.S., many policymakers are encouraging the production of ethanol and biodiesel as a way to reduce the need for foreign oil. In the United States, especially in like corn growing states, a fuel called E85 is 85% ethanol and 50% gasoline. It's available, and it's what we call flex fuel vehicles. Those guys, they can run on either gasoline or this E85 stuff, which is a mixture.